to Interview from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues from the point of view of the people who know them best, here on Telesur. Today we're going to be talking about Mexico's rural sector, where millions of small farmers struggle to survive in an increasingly hostile environment. The most recent threat to their livelihood comes from the energy reform that could potentially convert small farms into oil and gas production. What impact would this have on Mexico's small farmers and on the nation? To talk about these issues, we're very fortunate to have with us today Luis Meneses of the National Union of Autonomous Regional Farm Organizations and Jose Narro of the Coalition Plan de Ayala. Thank you very much for being on Interview from Mexico. I wanted to start right out with a question regarding what is the general situation in the countryside today? Would you characterize it as a crisis?
Sí, yo creo que
Yes, I think that, well, thanks to the Telesur and Laura for this interview. But we are in a severe crisis of the Mexican countryside, and the numbers show it very powerfully. The 20 years of the free trade agreement have meant greater food dependency. We depend more than, well, around 45% for the imports to feed Mexicans. And we are completely dependent in soybeans and rice, already more than 50% dependent in wheat, and more than 35% dependent in corn, not to mention powder milk and other goods. In terms of social impact, the Mexican countryside has deteriorated. The effect of the free trade agreement of 20 years ago and the policies of the government over various administrations over the last 30 years have caused a deterioration of the rural sector. According to the figures of INEGI and Coneval, there are 28 million Mexicans suffering food poverty. Of these 28 million, 20 live in the Mexican countryside. That means that there, where they produce food, is where there is the most hunger. A carpenter always has wooden chairs and wooden tables on his house. But small farmers can have food in their homes because these public policies that various administrations have applied in the past 30 years, and specifically in the last 3 administrations, including the current one.
And Jose, what would you add to that?
Comentar que ya hace más de 20 años en el país.
Well, I'd say that in the last 20 years in the country, first, they did the reform to Article 27 of the Constitution that modified and took away from small farmers the right to the land. Although the Mexican government promised in Fraction 7 of Article 27 of the Constitution to protect the social property of land, that is something it has not complied with. In second place, years later, in the year 1992, was the reform of Article 27. This allowed actually, they encouraged the liberation of the land, of the people's land on the market, when the land is the patrimony of many of the rural peoples of the country. And the other issue is that in 1994, the free trade agreement goes into effect. After all these years, what has happened in Mexico? Well, why are we experiencing a crisis? Well, there's a crisis of exclusion, a crisis of marginalization and poverty. There's a food crisis in the nation's rural sector, of the poor in general in Mexico. We have in the rural zone 60 to 70% of the rural population living in poverty. We have also along with this, a huge problem that in these around 20 years, a system of monopolies has been consolidated in Mexico. So the crisis is made worse with hunger, with exclusion, with marginalization, with poverty in the countryside, and with the enormous power that the monopolies have gained. And they've been ruining, looting, and expropriating the wealth of the men and women in the rural sector. So we have a new process of concentration of the land, a huge concentration of wealth in a few hands, and this has to do with major distortions in the market. In Mexico, for example, in the last years, the price of corn has gone down. 3 or 4 years ago, it was $5.20 for a kilo of corn. And this year it's $120 to $130 a ton, which puts it around 1,800, 1,900 pesos a ton of corn. But the kilo of tortilla is between 14 and 18 pesos a kilo, and a kilo of corn flour in the market is between 10 and 12 pesos a kilo. Mexico produces around 22 million tons of corn, and some 14 million are controlled by 3 large companies. To give us an idea, for every peso that one of these companies earns, we're talking about profits of 14 billion pesos, which is about the budget of Procampo for the entire country. It's huge, these profits that these companies make. The price of grains has dropped. The price of beans has fallen. The rural producers are being paid last year between 6 to 8 pesos a kilo, and in the market it's between 16 to 30 pesos a kilo.
Well, in this context, there seems to be agreement that the countryside faces huge obstacles in social, technological, and economic terms. What are the immediate needs of Mexico's rural sector?
One is the
lack of public policy from the government to improve the countryside and strengthen the countryside. What we think is that the Peña Nieto administration wants to eliminate the rural sector, and we say that with having carefully considered what it means. There are 2 measures that perhaps we'll talk more about later. Article 8 transitory of the energy reform says very clearly that if there is any type of energy underground, it is a cause of expropriation. This will apply to electrical energy, petroleum, gas, eolic areas will be caused now. Expropriation will not be for public causes, it will be for private causes. This is what Peña Nieto is doing with this, and this is a profound agrarian counter-reform, no doubt about it. On the other hand, in the budget for 2015, the budget that Peña Nieto sent to Congress, it says that they will take about 40 billion pesos from rural roads. Coincidentally, they are giving 60 billion to the airport they are planning for Mexico City. That is, there will be no more rural roads, no more repairs to rural roads this year. To make a new airport when the same investors that benefit from the bank scandal of Fobaproa are the ones involved in the airport.
I want to return to that point exactly, but first we'll take a short break. We're back with Luis Meneses and Jose Narro talking about the Mexican countryside. One of the other things that's established in this new energy reform is that it calls energy extraction an economic strategic priority for the country. What implications does that have for agriculture?
Son graves.
Well, they're very serious because this implies eliminating and subordinating a fundamental right. That's a human right. That's in Article 1 of the Constitution of the country, which is the right to property. With this, social property, indigenous property, and private property are subordinate to energy production. So now you can have your property, but the value of your property goes down. It loses value because now the interests of large energy companies are dominant. So your property at any moment can be dismantled, or it can be declared subject to right to use by others in favor of the energy companies. And you can be subject to loss of your land.
Y tú puedes ser fruto en cualquier momento del despojo.
In Mexico, we have nearly 200 million hectares, and there are 100 million in concessions to mining companies. And so, in this reform, not only does it apply to the energy sector, the issue of gas and petroleum, it also applies to the issue of water, which also generates energy. And also, it touches on carbon and mines. So there's a fundamental change because the land is now at the service of the huge energy monopolies of the world to be the priority and not to be used and to be practically destroyed by them, because a large part of these companies cause enormous pollution in the environment, especially the mining companies. So now energy production has more importance than food production. So all the agricultural labor, all the work in livestock, forestry, and fishing in the country is subordinated to activities in the area of mining, in the area of energy.
Well, Luis, Jose mentioned that with over half of Mexican territory in social property, that is to say, indigenous communal lands and ejidos, can these lands compete with transnational corporations in these terms? And what's likely to be the outcome? More migration? Or what will be the impact on campesinos today?
¿Cómo pueden competir? ¿Cómo podemos competir con todo?
How they can compete? How can we compete with all of this? It is about seeing if we can compete with these companies or not. It is a question of what kind of priorities do we want in this country. For us, for grassroots groups, for ejidos and indigenous communities and small farm organizations, the priority is to produce food so that Mexicans can be fed. First for the small farmers and then the entire population. This is the priority that the government should have. They're putting as the priority the energy needs of the United States. The United States has a necessity of getting energy from abroad the next 20 years to keep up with its own reserves. This is a policy that we've seen very clearly. So they say, let's exploit what we have close by, what we have as a possible reserve. More than that, we have to ask what policy does the government need to adopt to guarantee food supply for the Mexican population and not create more dependency for these foods. What we have to do is defend the land, and we're going to defend it. The reform package is not just about energy. And there was, like Jose mentioned it, the mining reform 20 years ago in 1993, 20 years ago in the Salinas administration, and now it is complete with this. But they also reformed the law of injunctions. Now if the government grants a concession, under the reform of last April, we can't file for injunction against the concession. We can file an injunction to defend our land, but not for a concession. They did this last year, so they have a package of reforms that reduces our rights. The communications reform, they say it was to combat large monopolies, but it also limits, for example, the television stations or the popular radio stations, community radios, and there are a lot of in the country. So this whole package of reforms has direct implications in the Mexican countryside in a negative way. And what is the only thing that the government proposes? Rural financing. It says, okay, now we're going to provide cheap loans, you don't have to put collateral, the collateral will be your production. This already happened in the laws more than 20 years ago. So they go back to this, but now within the practice of making loans. Today the government doesn't know how to give loans to small farmers. It has lost the practice, or they should tell us, since Peña made this declaration, how many loans it has given to date. But not because the small farmers don't feel like they need to receive loans, because they disconnected all the system and financial circuits in the countryside.
That's a very important point, and we'll come right back to it. We'll be back after a short break. We're back talking about the impact of the energy reform on Mexican agriculture. What we're seeing then is a process of privatization in the Mexican countryside. What implications does this have for rural producers?
Son sumamente.
They are very serious because this implies the privatization of the land and the privatization of water, and to give priority to the interests of the huge energy monopolies, not just of Mexico, but of the world. This also implies the energy reform included the liberation of prices, and the tendency is to eliminate state-owned enterprises of Pemex and the Federal Electricity Commission. These two huge companies of energy, producers and transformers and conductors of energy, will tend to disappear, and this Mexican oil wealth will fall into the hands of the large companies at the service of the United States mainly. And this will harm agriculture in a very serious way, especially since 90% of agriculture in the country is small-scale agriculture, and since the reform of Article 27 of the Constitution, they eliminated all the institutions and programs that supported this sector. CONASUPO was phased out. Fertimex, which was the state producer of fertilizer, was wiped out. The national producer of seeds, PRONACE, all the institutions were eliminated. And we have a process of privatization. What do we have now? Well, the supports for small producers have been eliminated. The small producers from the government, you have to have them in programs of subsidies and not production programs. When 90% of the land in the rural productive units are in their hands, and they are practically completely abandoned. So we think that poverty will increase, and the wealth of the country now will be transformed to the large energy monopolies and the agro-food monopolies. Food sovereignty will be lost even more now, since we import 45% of our food, and they calculate that by the year 2025, we'll be importing 70 to 80% of the national food needs. We will be a country that is completely dependent on the great powers, especially those that produce food like the United States.
Y Luis, what would you add to that?
I would like to take a look at the whole energy conglomerate that will be exploited. Like Jose mentioned in part a moment ago, the mining concessions that will be also able to exploit gas now, the gas that comes out of the mines, already have at least a third of the country land in their hands to carry out open pit mining, through concessions that the government has granted in 20 years. Oil, gas exploitation, electricity production, wind energy production will take over at least another third of the national territory. This will directly affect us. And I wanted to refer to another issue that's going to be new for Mexico. This issue of the rupture of the land called fracking. This is not only going to be to make a hole or a well and dig down 1 or 2 kilometers in the earth and make a crack to take out the oil or gas, but they're going to use millions of liters of water that will cease to exist on that land or underground to be able to do this exploitation. These wells for irrigation, for whatever natural use of water, whatever form of storing water that nature uses, will be lost in exchange for producing gas for a handful of transnational companies. This is another issue that we're not in agreement with. We're against the use of this technology. And furthermore, it is a destructive technology. It's not a technology to solve some specific problem that we have in some region. If they say, here we're going to produce gas because the development of the region depends on it, fine, we'll discuss that. But this isn't like that. This is to give out concessions. This is a concessionary government. That's the word that defines it.
So the reforms will also have a significant environmental effect.
Totally. Very heavy in all senses.
Now, I wanted to ask you, I know that just recently you held a national convention of peasant and indigenous organizations to discuss these problems. What were some of the major outcomes of that convention? And what are the demands of the sector today?
Ante esta política del gobierno de
faced with these policies of this government to subject itself to the needs of the United States and to launch strategies to displace and impoverish the rural people, the rural sector of the country, we began to remember that 100 years ago, the National Revolutionary Convention was held between Villa and Zapata in the context of the Mexican Revolution. And today we hold this National Indigenous Campesino Convention. Why? Well, to develop strategies that help us defend our land and our water. It's not possible that the mines don't pay a single peso for water when it's a concession and you pay for drinking water. It turns out now that the mining companies, for all the water they use in the open pit mines, to be able to wash the minerals and chemicals, they use cyanide and polluting substances. And they're leaving a huge amount of pollution in the country. And also the mining companies use an enormous amount of water. They're using it up. They're stealing it from the rural communities. They're taking their land.
Excuse me, Jose, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we're running out of time, and I wanted to ask very quickly Luis what he had to say about the demands and the results of the convention.
Ya explicó José
Yes, Jose explained one of the historic reasons for having held the convention the 14th and the 15th of this month, yesterday and the day before. One of the biggest results is the enormous convergence of organizations that attended. Not all of them, but a lot. It is a good base to be able to carry out actions that converge and to do them together. All are being affected and attacked by the public policies that are being applied. What do we demand? That food sovereignty becomes a reality, that rural financing becomes a reality, that rural defense becomes a reality, that human rights be respected in the countryside, and there are no more political prisoners. There are more than 80 now, and assassinations. The case of Ayotzinapa is just a sample of what's been happening in the countryside.
Well, this unity in itself is a big accomplishment. Thank you so much, Jose Narro, Luis Meneses. And thank you. I'm Laura Carlson, and we'll be back next week on Interview from Mexico.